Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video which goes through sleep debt and deprivation as part of the psychological health and wellbeing topic for stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So sleep debt is the accumulation of the difference between the amount of sleep a person needs to function at an optimal level and the amount they actually have if it's a deficit. So for example, if a person needs 8 hours of sleep each night, but they only get 7, they have a sleep debt of 1 hour. So you guys, you need a total of, well, ideally 10, but realistically 9 hours a night. But if you only get 7, then you've got a sleep debt of 2 hours, and so on and so forth. So our desire to sleep during the day increases the more sleep debt we have, which makes sense. So if we've only got a sleep debt of 1 hour or half an hour or something like that, in general, we're not going to be too affected. But if we have a very high sleep debt of 3 or 4 or 5 hours or more, obviously that's going to increase our desire to sleep during the day, and we're not going to be functioning at our optimal level. And that's the key word here in terms of this sleep debt definition. So the good news is that sleep debt does not continue to build up over a lifetime. Otherwise, we would be all permanently sleep deprived. Having a bad night's sleep now and then, obviously, is just a part of life. But if it continued, we would always be sleep deprived. So the good news about our sleep-wake cycle is that it is only a 24-hour cycle. So the good news is it won't build up as a result. So if we have one bad night's sleep, we can easily make up for it the second night. Having said that, if it's an ongoing issue, there are several dangers of sleep debt, especially if it's very, very high. So, 4 or 5 or 6 hours or more. So if it's consistent, it may lead to increased risk of diabetes, excessive anger, heart disease and heart attack, increased risk of accidents, increased risk of depression, high blood pressure and obesity. This is obviously worst case scenario here, but the more sleep debt that we have on a consistent basis, the more likely that these things may occur, but often they take months or years to develop. So obviously if we have sleep debt, that's going to lead to sleep deprivation. So this is when a person does not get the required amount of sleep to function at the optimal level. So in my previous video, I talked to you about sleep and age when we talked about theories of sleep. So really, teenagers between 15 and 17 should be getting 8 to 10 hours sleep, and adults should be getting between 7 to 9 or 7 to 8 hours sleep, depending on their age. So when we don't get that consistently and we've got constant sleep deprivation, we're not going to be functioning at the optimal level that's needed. So some common symptoms of sleep deprivation include increased daytime sleepiness, irritability, hand tremors are very, very common, slower reaction time, poorer memory, and microsleeps. So a microsleep is when our brain will automatically snatch some precious seconds or minutes of sleep without us knowing. So a microsleep can be very, very dangerous, especially when we're behind the wheel or we're doing a monotonous task. If we're very sleep deprived, our brain's need for sleep will overtake what's going on, and we will enter the stages of sleep even though we appear to look awake, or we will just nod off and fall asleep without our permission. That is a microsleep. So I talk more about microsleeps in a future video on fatigue. So in today's society, the average individual is getting just over 6 hours sleep. That's the average, which is obviously not enough, depending on the age and so on. Adults should be getting between 7 and 8, but on average, it's just over 6 hours of sleep, which is obviously a concern. So consistent reduction of recommended sleep can increase the risk of cancer, infection, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes in adults. Because we know that sleep is a circadian rhythm, if we're not getting enough sleep, it has an impact on our other circadian rhythms, such as our immune system, our cardiovascular system, diabetes, blood sugar tolerance, and so on. So sleep is extremely important, not only just for, our memory and our energy levels and repair and restoration, like I said in my theories of sleep video, it's also extremely important for our physical health, because if we don't get enough sleep consistently, we increase the risk of these very dangerous diseases. So how sleep deprivation affects our brain, this is in your workbook. So higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of depression, impaired cognition, and headaches and migraines. So sleep deprivation, again, short term, having a bad night's sleep now and then, no cause for concern. However, if it's ongoing, it is, both physically and mentally. So there are two types of sleep deprivation. There's partial sleep deprivation, which is the most common type, and this occurs when people don't get enough sleep most days of the week. But continuous sleep deprivation, that's more rare, is when people don't sleep at all for a very long period of time. Now, this is often used in training exercises for the army. So they will deliberately deprive their recruits of sleep, obviously to get them used to the physical and mental rigor of being in the armed forces. So it's part of the training. It's not very common though, and long-term periods of no sleep at all is actually very, very dangerous. So research on continuous sleep deprivation shows that on the second night of deprivation in experiments, people will fall asleep but deny it, so their comprehension is affected. On the third day, they become tense, apathetic, irritable, have mood swings, and of course microsleeps, and may experience hallucinations in some instances. And by the fourth day, people are showing paranoia and in some instances psychosis. So the hallucinations and paranoia, it's thought to be because the brain and the body is so desperate at this point for sleep that the brain will automatically enter stage 5, which we know is REM, and people will be dreaming and hallucinating and not knowing whether they're actually in stage 5 REM sleep or whether they are awake. So it can be very frightening, and they will report and show paranoia and psychosis. So there's two very famous experiments that we will go through in class. So Peter Tripp deprived himself of sleep for 201 hours, so 8 days straight. And record holder Randy Gardner deprived himself of sleep for 264 hours, or 11 days straight. So what are some social factors that can contribute to sleep deprivation? There's actually several things, all right? Some of you maybe have experienced these or guilty of these, but let's go through them because let's face it, we've all gone through them at some point in our lives. So co-sleeping and parenting choices. So bed sharing or room sharing can obviously be a factor that causes sleep deprivation. Sleeping with a newborn baby that needs to be fed every 2 hours, or sleeping with a pet that is very demanding of, bed space or something like that. That can obviously lead to sleep deprivation, and it's a social factor. One of the biggest causes of sleep deprivation, especially among young people, is media use. So the use of social media late at night, web surfing, watching TV, internet gaming, etc. Excessive usage of media use can lead to insomnia and, of course, depression. And we look more at this in our third topic, which is social influence. Extracurricular activities, so, late night sport, training, social lives, clubs, part-time work, obviously they can go into the late night hours and obviously lead to sleep deprivation or partial sleep deprivation during the week. Homework time can be a factor as well. So adolescents that spend more than 5 hours on homework per week are more likely not to meet minimum sleep guidelines. That should be 2, coupled with the exposure to light from devices. So having too much homework or not dedicating enough time to work while you're at school and then doing it all at home, that can lead to sleep deprivation. That coupled with typically when we do homework, looking at a screen, a laptop, an iPad, that can make the problem worse, as I've discussed in my previous videos. More social factors that can contribute to sleep deprivation, it may be the school schedule itself. So we had a good conversation about this in class, or we will have a conversation about it. So there is consideration recently to the different age groups. Obviously, it's not taken into consideration with the typical school and work starting times. The majority of students at school or start school at 8:30 a.m. and most adults are at work by 9 a.m. Now, obviously, shift workers don't fall into this category. I'll talk about that later. But the consideration to the different age group sleep needs is not really taken into consideration. So there is a push to suggest that maybe school starts later at about 10 a.m. That would obviously be a massive overhaul in our way of life. However, it would have a very serious knock-on effect in a lot of other areas and a lot of other disciplines. But one of the theories as to why social and sleep deprivation is so high is because of the school schedule. So maybe looking at changing the hours, which has been discussed as an idea for many years in psychology. Now, shift work is obviously something that leads to sleep deprivation as well. Some of you may be thinking of getting into an industry later on, or you may already be in an industry where shift work is apparent. So shift work is work that falls outside of the hours of 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. So this includes industries such as nursing, medicine, factory work, vintage, hospitality, the list goes on. Now, 1 in 5 shift workers develop what's called shift work disorder, where they are far more likely to develop insomnia and other negative health issues like I talked about previously. The good news is that shift workers can manage their sleep deprivation and their shift work symptoms. I talk about this in a separate video. As long as it's managed, shift work is very safe, but if it's not managed, it can lead to increased likelihood of very serious health issues such as cardiovascular disease, insomnia, diabetes, and so on. Now, jet lag is also a social factor that leads to sleep deprivation. So if you've traveled overseas, you no doubt would have gone through jet lag. So that is when our SCN, our suprachiasmatic nucleus, recognizes the time of day to be different from what external cues tell us. So this is obviously due to traveling through several time zones. So on average, it takes 1 day of adjustment for every hour of time zone change. So a 5-hour time difference, on average, it takes 5 days for our circadian rhythm to adjust. Typically, children have a much easier time of this because they need more sleep, and adults tend to suffer more. But on average, 1 hour for every day, 1 day, for every hour of difference. Now, some personal factors that can contribute to or lead to sleep deprivation include the following. These are the main factors. So just personal choices. So often we're driven by voluntary choices. So we choose to stay up to watch TV or talk on the phone or be on social media. It's just a choice that we have to stay up later and deprive ourselves of 1 more or 2 more hours sleep. Sleep disorders obviously need to be taken into account here. So people often don't have a choice. They want to get the correct amount of hours, but they have an illness or a disorder that prevents that from happening. So insomnia and sleep apnea and narcolepsy are the 3 main sleep disorders that we cover in this course in a separate video, which is coming soon. But all of them reduce sleep quality and quantity for different reasons. So medical or health problems can also lead to sleep deprivation. So chronic pain, anxiety disorders, substance misuse, depression, obesity, and schizophrenia all can lead to sleep deprivation or have sleep deprivation as a secondary symptom. There's also delayed sleep phase syndrome. So this is when a person's sleep is delayed by 2 hours or more of what is considered acceptable. So people, in other words, will choose to go to bed 2 hours later than what's considered acceptable. This causes difficulty in being able to wake up at the desired time, and approximately 7 to 16% of young people report difficulty with delayed sleep phase syndrome. So we'll deliberately go to bed later for a variety of reasons we've already talked about, and this leads to the inability to actually fall asleep at an acceptable time. And one of the main things that causes sleep deprivation, which we go into in a lot more detail later in this topic, is stress. So stress is a heightened state of physiological arousal. The National Sleep Foundation has found that 43% of people aged between 13 to 64 have reported lying awake at night due to stress at least once. That should be least, sorry, once in the past month. All right. So sleep is a major contributor to not being able to sleep properly and get good restorative sleep quantity and quality. Okay, so that sums up this video on sleep debt and sleep deprivation. I hope you found this useful. Any questions? Let me know.